When we think about the Second World War, we usually picture the battlefields, right? The sheer scale of the military destruction. But just beneath the surface of all that conflict was an incredibly insidious, highly organized, bureaucratic campaign to literally engineer the genetic future of Europe. Today, we're unpacking the source material on the Nazis' Lebensborn program, and we're going to focus heavily on a central, terrifying mystery: why a massive demographic panic ultimately led to the outright theft of human lives.
250,000. Take a second to really let that number sink in. That is an estimated 250,000 Eastern European children who were kidnapped during World War II. Up to 250,000 kids just stolen from their families, their homes, and their entire cultures. And this wasn't some random accident of war. No, this was a deeply calculated, deliberate policy.
Which brings us to the big question driving our explainer today. Why? Why would a regime that was so obsessively focused on its own twisted idea of racial purity look beyond its borders and resort to mass kidnapping to build its future? Well, to wrap our heads around this staggering atrocity, we actually have to work backward to the perceived demographic crisis that set the whole thing in motion. Section 1. The Fount of Life. Demographic Panic in the Third Reich. Before the kidnappings escalated to such terrifying heights, there was a massive panic brewing among the Nazi leadership about a rapidly shrinking population. It all came down to a catastrophic drop in birth rates. Back in 1900, Germany saw about 2 million births, but by 1933, the very year the Nazis took power, that number had plummeted to just 960,000. For a regime gearing up for an ideological war of annihilation, this was a total disaster. Social stigma against unmarried pregnant women was driving up abortion rates. And when you combine that with the inevitable casualties of a future war, this demographic collapse directly threatened their pipe dream of an Aryan utopia. Basically, they needed to manufacture a population, and they needed to do it fast. So, SS leader Heinrich Himmler's big solution was to found Lebensborn, which translates to Fount of Life, in December of 1935. This was essentially a state-sponsored breeding program. The idea was to remove common obstacles to having children, like financial stress or social shame. They set up these secret nurseries for women to give birth in. The association even forged birth certificates for single mothers, officially classifying them as widowed or divorced just to protect them, and they took over legal guardianship of the kids to keep the fathers' identities totally hidden. Section 2. Producing the Aryan elite. The bureaucracy of purity. Now, you might think this sounds like an act of charity, but it absolutely wasn't. The welfare they provided came with some incredibly sinister, strict conditions. Mothers trying to get into these nurseries faced intense scrutiny to prove their so-called purity. We're talking hereditary health certificates, invasive medical investigations by SS doctors, extensive questionnaires, the whole 9 yards. And once they were inside, life was rigidly controlled. Women were forced to do household chores, forced to breastfeed, and had to give birth with absolutely zero painkillers. Before they could leave, they were literally graded on a scale of 1 to 3 based on their character, their health, and their political attitude. Anyone who didn't fall in line was immediately kicked out and stripped of all protection. And for the babies who scored the highest, the regime wanted to lock them into their ideology immediately. They completely did away with traditional christenings and replaced them with an SS name-giving ceremony. The directors would actually touch the infants with a ceremonial SS dagger, reciting oaths that placed the child under the protection of the SS. The mother had to swear to raise her kid completely within the National Socialist worldview, and they even assigned an SS godfather to make sure she kept her word. But here is the wild part. Despite all this intense bureaucratic obsession with purity and perfection, the reality inside these supposedly elite nurseries was just awful. In 1940, an advisory doctor named Wilhelm Pfannenstiel visited and noted that the babies had crusted noses, scratched faces, and were wrapped in badly washed, ragged, gray diapers. It was a landscape of total squalor. Because these homes were packed to the brim, holding something like 2.5 times the number of kids they were built for, the actual level of care was shockingly low. Diseases like whooping cough and pneumonia just tore through these vulnerable infants. 8%. Because of these incredibly overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, the children paid the ultimate price. Now, it's tough to nail down the exact numbers because the association almost certainly forged the records, but independent estimates suggest the child mortality rate in these specific homes hit up to 8%. It was a completely failing system right out of the gate. Section 3. Expanding the breeding program, the Nordic obsession. Despite the absolute failure going on internally, as the regime pushed its borders outward, Himmler aggressively expanded his breeding program right along with them. Nurseries popped up in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but Himmler had this bizarre obsession with Norway. He decided Norwegian women were, in his words, Nordic enough to bear perfect Aryan children. Throughout the war, around 8,000 Norwegian women went through the 10 nurseries set up there, leading to about 6,000 births. But here's the tragic catch. Participating in this program and having a child with a German soldier instantly branded these mothers as treacherous collaborators back home, which meant they actually had very little real choice in the matter.
Section 4. Kidnapping for the Reich, the 1942 escalation.
So, what exactly happens when voluntary breeding just isn't moving fast enough to replenish a dying army? By early 1942, the Nazis had lost over 1 million men in their ideological war. Facing a drawn-out conflict and massive troop losses that completely eclipsed anything their breeding program could replace, Himmler ordered a truly horrific escalation. In February 1942, he officially authorized the mass theft of Eastern European children, specifically targeting those he decided were carriers of valuable blood so they could be Germanized and absorbed into the Reich. This created a cold, highly systematic pipeline for hundreds of thousands of stolen kids. Step 1. They were shipped off to special children's concentration camps in places like Brockau and Kalisz. Step 2. They were medically evaluated by Lebensborn health officials. Kids under 6 were handed forged birth certificates, given brand new Germanized names, and then deliberately re-educated. The goal was to completely and permanently erase their Polish or Eastern European heritage before shipping them off to German nurseries for even more evaluations.
The final evaluation for these kidnapped kids is absolutely chilling to think about. If they passed these bizarre pseudo-scientific tests and were judged sufficiently German, they got to keep their forced new identity and were put up for adoption. But if they failed, they were shipped straight back to Poland, usually thrown right back into the brutal camp system or sent directly to extermination factories. Their entire right to live depended on a completely fabricated metric of racial purity. Section 5. A failed pipe dream. The post-war legacy. So, after looking at this massive machinery of state-sponsored kidnapping, breeding, and pseudoscience, what did they actually achieve? It was a total numerical failure. Ultimately, only about 12,000 children were born in the German nurseries, plus another 6,000 in Norway. That didn't even scratch the surface of their demographic crisis. What it did do was leave thousands of innocent kids with a lifelong stigma, facing intense exclusion and oppression. To escape the backlash, many mothers and children actually fled to Sweden. And as a fascinating side note, among those who emigrated was Anni-Frid Lyngstad, who you probably know better as one of the members of the global pop sensation ABBA. She eventually spoke out publicly about the immense challenges of being a child born out of this exact program. And then there's this number, 14 million. This is the ultimate historical irony. After the war, during Germany's massive economic boom, even a natural baby boom couldn't keep up with the country's need for growth. So, between 1955 and 1973, Germany brought in 14 million guest workers from incredibly diverse places like Italy, Turkey, Morocco, and Yugoslavia to actually rebuild the country. More than 2 million of them settled permanently, completely shattering Himmler's horrific pipe dream of an isolated, supposedly pure race. I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up our explainer today. When you reflect on the absolute desperate extremes of this ideology, an ideology that literally kidnapped 250,000 children out of sheer demographic panic, consider how it was ultimately defeated, at least in part, by the sheer resilience and necessity of human diversity. How does understanding this incredibly dark piece of history reshape the way we view the diverse, interconnected societies that we live in today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive gave you a really profound new perspective on the source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.